Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grid Talk Tuesday, episode number 29. My name is Alexander Searle. Joining me in a couple of moments are going to be my wonderful co-hosts, Kaleb, Emory and Alex. But we had some great racing action this past weekend. The United States Pro Kart Series finished off its fifth and final round at Newcastle Motorsports Park. We crowned a bunch of champions. Austin Garrison ran his first full X30 championship season since 2019. It worked out for him pretty well, I'd say, becoming a champion. His second national title since, I believe, US Open many, many years ago. So, that being said, let's bring in both guests at the same time here, Kaleb Vieska and Emory Lida. Welcome to the show, boys. Kaleb, I'll start with you. You and I were announcing in the booth this past weekend. So, what do you think stood out to you this past weekend?
I think firstly, what probably stood out to most people was the fact that Xander wasn't there this past weekend. He is feeling much better, which I think was the first thing that we thought about as soon as we were done with the weekend. So that's why you guys heard a whole lot from myself and Alex. But the first thing that stood out to me was probably the storms. It was a very long weekend. Firstly, I'm just going to put it bluntly. The racing wasn't as exciting because the storms were there and because, it was filled with rain racing all weekend long. And there were some exciting races here and there, but I think for the most part, it was kind of huge gaps throughout the heat races and huge gaps throughout some of the main events as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, that's what's going to happen, right, when you get rain racing.
Yeah.
You're going to get the field spread. You're going to have some outliers. We got some good racing. I think we had a great championship battle in a couple of classes. K Junior brought some pretty good excitement, I'd say, almost, F1 2012 level Sebastian Vettel in front of the field sort of thing. So, that being said, Emory, on the production side, I mean, you got pretty much a front row view just like us, besides just having a mic with you announcing the race. So, what do you think besides the rain racing? Did anything stand out to you besides that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, it was kind of a bittersweet weekend. Of course, getting to see a full weekend in the rain, a full national weekend was pretty unique in itself. I want to start the show by saying I hope that all my family, all my friends that are in Western North Carolina are recovering well. I mean, it was a really difficult weekend for a lot of them, and especially all up and down the East Coast. There's a lot of damage done by Hurricane Helena, and I mean, we saw the after effects of that in Newcastle with 60-mile-an-hour winds on Friday night. So it was kind of tough being up there and seeing kind of after effects of that. But on the racing side of things, I think unlike Kaleb, I'd say as much as the racing kind of was a little bit more spread out, a little bit more vanilla, I think we saw some real high-end stuff when it came down to the quality of racecraft. Like what the X30 final in a drying track, the K Junior final, seeing Garzone run through half of the field, seeing the amount of guys that were quick on one session during the weekend, whether it be on a kind of drying track or on a more like torrential downpour type track, it offered up a lot of different differences, and you kind of got to see stylistic differences. So from kind of like a pure technical side of things, I felt like it was a fascinating weekend because it's rare that we see washouts like this. I can't remember the last time we went to a national weekend and the whole weekend was a total wipeout. We've had days that were rainy, we had sessions that were rainy, we've had torrential downpours, drying tracks, but to have all of that in one weekend was pretty sick. And even if the on-track product wasn't amazing, even if there's a lot of people in the paddock that got wet that probably would have liked for it to be dry at some point, I think it was a fascinating weekend to unpack. And I mean, of course, you would have liked to see some more like on-track battles, but I think the technical battle that we got, the kind of like chess match, so to speak, in the rain, really offered up a fun, exciting title package.
Hey, and before we proceed here, Alex, shout out Emory keeping us updated with the championship battles in our ears all weekend long. Whenever we say we just got intel, Emory just told us what is about to happen on the racetrack with as far as championship battles go. So shout out to Emory. And I'm not trying to say that it was like boring, and I was like falling asleep the whole time. But it was like, it just I was excited to see dry racing because it was supposed to be like a speedway kind of race this weekend with the kind of the racetrack being long, and from what we saw last year in KA, I was excited for it, and I was just kind of sad that we didn't get that this year, especially. Well, the main reason was because of the rain. But again, best wishes to everybody who was affected by it. I know some people from Florida from the racetrack also got affected, so our best wishes go out to them. But again, just wanted a little bit more, I guess.
I think it was interesting in its own right. I mean,
Yeah,
the product itself, like if you wanted, a barn burner, you're never going to get that in the rain. But you're going to get, stylistic differences, like Emery mentioned, with different lines and some drivers who are more confident in their abilities in the wet or just, feel comfortable
yeah,
more than others. You're going to see drivers make moves happen in the opening stages of the races. And I think we had a couple of great ones. I think Heat 2, I want to say, K Senior, where half the field at some point went off the racetrack in turn number 4, Kaleb, if you remember that, at some point, where
yeah, yeah,
there was a big puddle on the inside of turn number 4, and drivers were trying to go over it, and it just wasn't not working.
yeah.
Heat 3, X30 Senior, every single driver but Austin Garrison went off the racetrack. So in those situations, I think the racing's really good. You made a good point on the broadcast, Kaleb, of everybody wants the rain race because we get dry racing all year long, and then when the rain comes, you want dry racing.
That's so bad. Well, also, like for me, I had just gotten back from Amarillo the weekend before, and we had rain racing all weekend long, I think, until the main event. And then like it's just two back-to-back weekends of like coming back to the hotel with like soggy socks and like wet feet that are just like pruned. Like it was just not fun at all. Obviously, this
Hey,
weekend was a little better because I wasn't outside. So like shout out KC crew
shout out
that
the
was out
camera
there.
crew, man.
Shout out camera crew. Shout out Trevor Blue. Shout out Brandon
Yeah.
Simone. Shout out anybody but us three who wasn't outside. That we weren't outside. But like it's like Riley Can, Kyle Cuthbert, like all those guys. Huge shout out to all of them. For being out there and like just working their butts off. USPKS crews.
USPKS, yeah.
Yeah, dude. It was not a fun weekend in terms of like, like the wetness of everything. But yeah, it was besides that, I think it was pretty cool to see some rain racing. But when it came, it's just like, like really, man? Like I just felt like we like something good was taken away from something that could potentially would have been good was taken away from us.
Well, before we get into setting the grid, Kaleb, we have some new partners for the show. You
Yeah.
want to run us down a little bit what we got going on?
Yeah, for sure. So this past week, just finalized the deal. I know Emory as well is supporting one of them, but DPK Americas and FA Kart has joined the Grid Talk show here this week. So huge shout out to Max Martinez, Nick from Benek as well, who's partnering with the Driven team to push this brand as well here in the U.S. So huge shout out to DPK Americas, to the FA Kart as well, that are joining us on for the future as well. So excited for that. And again, a huge shout out to Max Martinez, who we got the deal done with. And we're excited. We got some cool stuff coming with them. And I know they have some team representatives from Europe as well coming on the show later on this year, whenever their schedule opens up. So it'll be cool to see the eye of karting from another part of the world. So we're excited for that. And I know PitFit as well as an exciting one, Emory.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I mean, I've worked with Trey, I've worked with PitFit for a number of years now. And of course, if you don't know, PitFit has two locations in Charlotte and Indianapolis, and an all-star lineup, not just internally with the guys that they have on staff, but also the drivers they've worked with over the years. I mean, you want to talk about pretty much anyone that's been up at the front of IndyCar has probably been in contact or worked with PitFit at some form over the years. A lot of karting drivers through over the years that have done well. Guys like Weston Workman, we've seen Tyler Wettengill be up front, as well as a lot of other guys. So, you want a company that will get the most out of driver fitness. PitFit is that company, and I'm excited to have them on board again. They've been a part of my personal journey for a long time at this point, between Trey and then lately the PitFit brand as well. And so to kind of have them and be able to kind of showcase what they've got is huge for us. And again, I'm really excited to work with them going forward and kind of set them into the karting market as well, because it's one of the things that they've really worked at over the years, and kind of expanding their market, whether it be in Indiana with drivers local to Newcastle, or in Charlotte with drivers more local towards Mooresville and that area, and their online program as well.
Very well said, boys. I mean, yeah, thank you so much, DPK Americas. Thank you so much, PitFit. It is a pleasure to go represent you guys for this show. That being said, let's get into setting the grid really quickly here. Just a couple things to go over. We already alluded to it earlier on here, but we have Mr. Austin Garrison, who won the championship for United States Pro Kart Series this past weekend. So really cool for him and for a driver that, I mean, hasn't run a full season since 2019, been bouncing around teams, has taken, gap years throughout his career. I mean, it just goes to show you the level of driver that he is, right? And we kind of
Mhm.
joked around with him, you and I, Kaleb, about we asked him, where did you think you'd still be here? Mid 20s. He said no, but here he is, and he's at the top of his game
That's not nearly what he said. He funny enough, because I walk in and go in to talk to Gary, like we like to call him, and I was like, dude, like, what would you tell that 15-year-old kid, like, on the train to Ocala, like, today, And he was like, well, Austin Garrison, he's a very hell yeah brother type of guy. That's his pretty that's his slogan. But he pretty much said, he was like, I would have told him to stay in college, dude. Like, I'm 26, still doing this, barely gonna get my first championship. I would have told him to stay in college. But I think, all jokes aside with him, he's done a lot for the sport as well, developing new young drivers as well, day to day, and training kids back in Florida. And as well, with the development that he's done with some of the drivers under SCR, is super, super cool to see for him, and to finally get his championship. I know he was super happy about it, and talked to him, and he was, as happy as can be to finally get that weight off his shoulders.
Emory.
Yeah, well, I think first off, if you want to be like the well, actually type, he did he did win a Challenge of the Americas back in 2018, I believe, it was 2017. So technically speaking,
This
he
guy,
does have a national championship,
this
but
guy.
for his first actual national championship that we can count, and certainly the biggest championship of his career, which is shocking, honestly, because of all the guys that you would think of over the years that have won national races that have been up at the front of the national scene, I think Garrison's probably the only one that hasn't won in single speed a national championship. I mean, we've seen Norberg get his. We saw Brandon Jarsakrak win a number of championships, Brandon Lemke, Braden Eves, even down to someone like Alex Brignoli at least got a couple. So for Austin
Mhm.
Garrison to not have a national championship up until this point was an anomaly. And hey, I mean, I'm glad that it happened. I mean, if you want to look
Yeah.
at some of the most influential figures in the sport on the driving end over the last couple decades, Austin Garrison's up there in America, not just for his driving ability, but also for the coaching, like you mentioned, Kaleb, for the amount of drivers that he's kind of influenced, dating back really, I mean, whether it be with his current job with SCR, whether it be with his driver coaching with Raleigh, what he did at CRG, what he did at Comcart, what he did at Fullerton, what he did even back to the OGP days, and a little bit with Gary as well. Like, I mean, you could name a host of different teams, a host of different brands, and countless drivers he's worked with that he's helped over the years. So, as much as it might have been a bit anticlimactic this weekend, not getting the victory that he would have won and not really having a close championship battle, I mean, this is a career accomplishment for him, and I think that it's great to see him on the top step. And I mean, again, for someone that has been as good as he has been over the years, has represented as many brands as well as he had over the years, I think it's beyond time, and it's very much well deserved for him to get this championship.
You mentioned anticlimactic. I'm sure if there's one guy that would disagree with you, it's Austin Garrison because he looked like when he took off his helmet, it was a sigh of relief that this championship was
Mhm.
over, right? Because after Dowsman, he kind of heard all the noise of, okay, he's got a really good shot now because ADT has a DNF, Norberg has multiple. This is his to go out there and lose. And so to go out there and not only just play it safe, he put on a clinic through qualifying and the heat races. The future race, we'll get into that later on in the show of, the difficulties these drivers had to go on and navigate that drying racetrack. But in the heat races, there was nobody that could even touch what they were able to do for speed concepts. So congratulations, Austin Garrison. We'll give him a quick round of applause here. AG29, Austin Garrison. One more thing to get into for setting the grid really quickly here. Alessandro DeTulio. This is a long time coming, I'd say, because once he really hopped into the car side of things this year for the second half of the USF Pro2000 series, we had an idea maybe this will be coming, but he announced, actually officially announced that Supernats will most likely be his last pro karting race for now. That being said, we know how this stuff goes, so we'll
Mhm.
see. But for ADT, I mean, he's done so much for the sport at such a
Yeah.
young age. I mean, to call him, it's so weird to call him a veteran and senior, but he is because
Yeah.
he's so young, but he's been doing it for this is his 4th year now in senior.
Hmm.
I mean, really incredible stuff, and he's been able to take a lot of teams to that next level. And so, I mean, when we heard this news, boys, I'll start with you, Kaleb. You know what crossed your mind?
Yeah, I mean, so firstly, whenever he pretty much told me this, I was actually just at our hotel, and then ran into him and Harley, and then went into the room, and we were just pretty much, chit chatting and talking about everything racing and stuff outside of racing too. And he pretty much broke the news to me that this was probably gonna be his last regular season race, and Supernats was as well going to be his last pro karting race in quite some time. I believe he wanted to come back and continue to do Supernats year in year out. But I think he's got some deals and on what could be his last chance of getting a ride in probably IndyCar in the future, right? So for a kid with a lot of talent, I think it's been so cool. When I first joined or when I first, started watching Kart Chaser about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and the start, seeing this kid mature so much has been, I think, one of the biggest things for me, right? Growing as a fan, and now I could say that ADT is almost like a friend, is super cool as well. And seeing him grow and mature and lead a team like he has for the past 2 years, I think has been really cool. And to putting that team up at the front with Winter Series championships and everything that he's done. So a huge shout out to ADT. And it's going to be sad to not see him at the racetrack next year or to even crack a joke with him here and there. So kind of sad to see him go, but again, I'm excited for his future. I'm excited for what's to come for him, and hopefully the end goal works out for him, which is one day getting an IndyCar drive.
Emory?
I expect to see him back at some point. It's how it usually goes. Not as a full-time driver. I think he's on a path to having a great career, and certainly the car side of things looks pretty promising in 2024, and he's got great things lined up for 2025. And again, like you mentioned, it's great to see him mature over the years and kind of see that development because, I moved to full-size karts in 2020 with AM, with Ariel. We saw kind of that development move straight into senior in 2021, and then again, had a few different controversies, a few different things, but he's been lightning fast from the get-go. Ran with different teams. He's led different teams. We saw him with Motez and what he was able to do with their operation. We saw last year for the bit that he was with Prime, kind of improving their game and bringing them up towards the front. And now with NRMS, I think he's been nothing but a team leader, nothing but a culture builder. And again, I'm excited to see what he does going forward. But, I've heard the story so many times of, I'm not going to be able to get back into kart. And somehow, some way, it might be for Supernats, it might be for one-off races. It happens. So I'm wishing Ali the best. I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, he's coming back to karts full time or something like that. But I always take these like retirement talks with a bit of a grain of salt. But it is cool to see him move on up full time to cars in 2025.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.
All right, that's it. Hey, shout out ADT.
Wait.
Shout out ADT.
Way to bring the whole
Another-
mood down.
Another 60 years off, if you know, you know.
Hey, shout out ADT, man. Shout out ADT. Shout out ADT
Oh
for
man,
real.
I'm sad now. I just,
I've got a tear in my eye. I just got way too emotional.
well,
All right, proceed. We got some cool stuff coming up.
So
That's some happy
that's
stuff.
that's been setting the grid. We're gonna try to bring up the mood for all of you back at home. We're probably crying now, but yeah. Well, thank you, ADT. We hope to see you back in the karting paddock. I mean, obviously Supernats this year, but I suspect we'll see him around. Like you said, Emery, even if it's for the one-time Supernats every once in a while. Maybe we go to Homestead every year, so we know he likes Homestead. That being said, we have some pretty cool things to get into, like Kaleb said. Let's talk about some USPKS racing. We talked about how it rained the entire weekend. Thursday, dry. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, pouring rain. We had some drying racetracks, but it was just constant inclement weather that just doused the racetrack at all times. We have a pretty special guest to actually bring on board here to discuss it more. We're going to bring on Simon Sikes. Simon, people may know you from USF Pro2000, USF Pro. You're also one of our producers that when you can, off your busy schedule, you work for us and you kill it on the production side. But Welcome to the show, bud.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Always a pleasure to be back with the Car Chaser boys. Been a while, but good to be back and lots to chat about. Big weekend there in Newcastle. And I did have one note because Kaleb said earlier, offhand comment of his last chance at IndyCar. The kid's 18. Alessandro Di Giulio's got plenty of time. He's in USF Pro2000. He's a very strong competitor. He's had some good races with him this year, so he's got a long career ahead of him, and certainly by no means his last chance.
All right, well let's get right into it. Yeah, a good point, because I know Kaleb probably just made you feel pretty old there.
Sorry.
All right, I want to start this with a pretty interesting clip that I was able to get together. Throughout the weekend, I'd say we saw a couple of different driving styles this past weekend, right? We had, I say, 3 notable ones that you can look at and say these were the main driving styles. The first one, this is Cooper Shipman in the main event. This is actually pretty much how he drove most of the heat races and into the main events, and this is more of the really pitch the go-kart quickly into the corner, allow the kart to rotate, and then from there you get back on the gas. To me, this is the driving style that's probably most common that I saw throughout the weekend, and I'm sure you boys can attest to it. For Kaleb and Emory that were at the racetrack, it's easier to be consistent this way because you don't have to be so accurate with your hands, and you kind of can just wait for the grip to come to you. And this driving style also worked for the main event for him, for me, because it was during that portion of the racetrack where it was drying enough to where you can start exploring parts of the racetrack. And we'll get into more of it once we get through all the clips here. The next driving style that I saw that was pretty prominent was AJ's style. Now, this was very similar to Cooper's, right? It's the same sort of concept, pitch the go-kart in, but he keeps his wheel turned for a lot longer. And because he's a taller driver, so this is the benefit of not being Kaleb and I's height, where you can, for example, look at turn 3 here. He'll pitch the go-kart in, lots of steering input, and he shifts his body weight forward. So he's just getting maximum rotation out of the front end, and it's allowing the go-kart to really just rotate better than others. And there's a reason why, if you pause it right here with a lap to go, there's nobody behind him, and he's leading this race by a mile. The final clip, now this is a little bit more of an anomaly, right? Because Speed Concepts, from the moment I arrived on Thursday, and then it poured on Friday, and we only got 2 practices, watching Garrison compared to essentially everybody else out on the racetrack, this go-kart was hooked up for Speed Concepts. I mean, you watch his hands. Now, Garrison's a naturally smooth driver, right? Not to say that others aren't, but he's naturally a very smooth driver with his hands and his feet. This steering wheel doesn't move at all. And you can boil it down to the setup all you want. Rain driving is not a new concept for teams and drivers, right? Like there's a decently baseline setup that you can go off of, especially around Newcastle, and you can get close. And when you have 2 practices, you had the happy hour. This is a clip from heat number 1. You have enough time at that point to figure out what the setup is. To me, this is more than setup. This is Garrison's driving style in terms of how smooth he is with the wheel. He's patient, right? He's not overcharging the corner. He's not trying to heat up the front tires. He's letting the kart come to him. So this is something that I really thought was awesome. That's why I clipped basically the entire lap, because you can just look at his hands and how smooth they are. He's fighting it slightly with the traction, but you almost couldn't tell. So I'm going to go back to shipments here. And Emory, I'll start with you. What's the biggest thing you see here from this sort of driving style, especially with this compound rain tire?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, it's the safe, the consistent option. It's kind of what you're initially taught to do when you race in the rain in karts, is very, very much aggressive on the initial input, pitch the kart in. It allows you to be more aggressive on entry and kind of get away with carrying more entry speed. And I mean, again, what Shipman did was a solid style. Like, it's not picking on Cooper Shipman to say, yeah, what he did was kind of the average, the baseline. He did it well. I mean, if you look at his pace throughout the weekend, it was top 5, top 10 throughout the weekend. I will say on this compounded tire, though, it's something that I learned actually when I practiced. I had 1 session on this rain tire when we went to Dowsman, and then we went 2 months, and then I had the shootout Miami Grands was fully in the wet. And so what I learned from 1 session to the next is this style of really hard initial input on this level on this rain tire makes it to where the kart doesn't react as well to it. There's kind of an overload of front grip, which is very, very rare in the rain. Normally, you're always fighting the front of the cart and trying to get as much front rotation as possible, but it unsettles it more to do that heavy kind of lift, and you're never able to get kind of the full traction. Whereas if you look at what AJ was able to do, right, it's a similar input style, right? The initial input is also aggressive, but he holds the wheel, holds the rotation for longer. And what that does is it essentially kind of balances out the center of the corner. And on these long radius corners, which is pretty much any corner you run it in the rain with the rain line, is going to be a longer radius than what you run in the dry. What that does is it basically kind of keeps the lift more centered. He does lean forward to maximize the front grip even more, but it's not unsettling the cart. It's a very stable line, and he's able to trust the center speed where he gained the most time all weekend long compared to guys like Hernandez, James Overbeck, Finn Bailiff, and the other guys that were up towards the front of the field. Was center to exit off. He was able to carry so much more apex onwards, and it's because of his smoothness with the hands. And then when you go to Garrison, when you look at this last clip, I mean, like you mentioned, the setup here is on rails. Like speed concepts, whether it be with Garrison in X30 or with Jackson Wolney in X30 Junior, their carts look tremendous, but you need a good driver. You need a driver that is smooth, that can kind of keep that wheel input in like Garrison to make it work. And what you'll see, again, watch the hands. You can't really see it as much on this kind of longer angle, but when he goes into the double left, or the double right, excuse me, it's just so smooth. There's like 1-2 corrections, but it's all under control. The line is perfect. The cart doesn't jump out on him. And again, it's that difference in wheel input. When you're aggressive on the wheel like Shipman, it can get you consistency. It can get you a little bit there, but you're going to sacrifice that roll speed from center off, especially on a rain compound that's softer than any compound we've had in karting, or at least on the MG side of things in the last decade.
Simon, I'll go to you next year. You haven't been in the kart seat in a minute, but rain driving is conceptually the same, whether you go from karts to cars. What stands out to you when going through these different clips?
Immediately as I watch it, I don't really deviate into really three big styles so much as I do two. What we saw with Cooper Shipman and what we saw with Garrison. And I kind of find AJ is almost that middle ground, and it's what you're doing on the entry to the corner. Garrison is, to me, looks like it's backed up a little bit more on the entry in maximizing the lateral grip all the way through the corner. So it's a nice consistent roll focused on the exits. Whereas you look at the guys that are slipping the fronts really hard on the way in, and they're almost stopping it on the front tire, using that front tire as a brake, pushing it past its slip angle and letting it bite into the track. And typically you'll see that with a harder compound tire where you're really trying to get that front grip down and load the front of the cart where you're going to find that rotation. And something to me where Garrison really stood out is if you have a soft compounded tire, you can really use that lateral grip more. You don't have to charge it so hard on entry, as you can kind of back it up and you almost have this float through the corner where you're just kind of guiding the steering wheel rather than over saturating the front tires to make the grip. So I think either style can work, and it really comes down to the track conditions. But those are what the points that immediately stand out to me. And I really like that Garrison style of driving where you're just very controlled on the entry and letting the cart do its job all the way through the corner. You're not fighting it too hard. You're not throwing massive inputs at it. You're just letting it do its work. It's going to be really kind to the tire, and it's going to give you really good mid-corner exit speed. So those are the two things that immediately stand out to me out of these clips.
I mean, that's the key, right? You said it. I was about to mention the same thing. It's kind on the tire. I mean, you look at Shipman's style here. This was a clip from the main event. So at this point, you're not too concerned about the tire. I think because it was a drying racetrack, and we never got a clip of it on the broadcast. When we were on commercial after the X30 Senior main, which was the final main of the day, those tires looked like slicks because of how much they chunked up because the track was that dry. Now, this KA Senior race was about an hour and a half before that X30 Senior main, so this was still a wet enough racetrack to where it couldn't handle a slick. No, it could not handle a slick. But it was almost at that weird point where the track was like too dry for a rain tire and too wet for a slick, and so you don't really know what tire to go on. And that's why after this, when you get to the mini and the X30 Junior race, where we actually saw a dry line forming, right now it's just one damp racetrack, as you see on Shipman's on board. that's where you get to that risk level of when you pitch the go-kart in really hard, you start really burning the fronts. And I would love to actually have seen Shipman's front tires after this race and other drivers that have that style, because I think it probably would have looked uglier than a Garrison style of driver. Kaleb, we haven't spoken about to you yet about it, but what do you think was the biggest thing that really pointed out about all three styles?
Man, first of all, I'm not going to use as big words as you guys all had because my vocabulary is not that big, sadly. That's my first point. Secondly, I mean, I really think whenever you talk about styles, firstly, the thing that stands out to me the most, the conditions and Shipman and AJ's video is way different to what you see in Austin's. Firstly, again, and I think benefit of the doubt for AJ and Cooper especially, it's a much different racetrack than what Austin was driving in. Right, so they could be going through a lot of things, as in tires degrading a lot sooner than what Austin's are, which is allowing him to put on the drive that he did. But I really think one of the biggest things that I think stood out to me that we're going to get into later on in the day is like you said, Alex, is finding that happy median, like some of the drivers did in the main event, was just either using tires that had 2 laps on them, used reins, or a full-on wet set. So I think that has a lot to do with it, especially whatever was in play for a lot of drivers as well. Like the availability of equipment this weekend was huge. I think we heard from one of the Masters drivers in Martin Stone. He was saying he was just saving his stuff because they didn't have all the tires in the world to go out there and put 2 laps on in the warm up and then, all right, off the track, and we're going to save these for our heat races. I think that was one of the big factors again. So benefit of doubt to Cooper as well on that respect. But yeah, I think stylistically, I'm a guy that you're going to see me drive a lot like Cooper Shipman, because I just don't have that much experience in the rain. I think I probably have more time driving on slicks in the rain than I do having driving on wet tires. And half the time when you drive on slicks, you're full lock, going through the corners, turning, and it's the same thing. So, yeah, I think that's what most people are thought. But I think for a guy like Garrison, who had a lot of laps on the weekend, I mean, Alex, you saw him on the Friday. He was just ripping, dude, in the full wet conditions. And I think, again, some people didn't have as many sets probably available to them like the rest of the field. So I think that was one of the biggest factors as well for me.
Well, I want to hop in real quick on the Shipman point, because there's definitely points and times where that driving style is the way that you have to do it, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at Heat 3 of the X30 race, which I think is the one that Garrison's clip is from, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Alex, that track is almost bordering on the point where a style like Shipman's in a lower horsepower category would be the way to go. When it's like that wet, lots of hydroplaning, lots of like, I don't care. You could have the softest tire possible on it. It's still going to handle like a boat. There's points where that's the right strategy to go along with. And again, I think like it's so difficult to adjust to that in a driver. It speaks to the quality of driver that really Austin Garrison, but in my opinion too, the clip with AJ, finding that kind of right balance between the two, because AJ was able to utilize a lot of the entry speed of what a Shipman was able to find, as well as kind of keeping that center off more smooth. And again, I think like both of those guys are quality drivers. Like Simon mentioned, kind of prioritizing the exit on Austin's point, his ability to just kind of trust the kart as well as trust himself, keep the hands extremely smooth. That roll speed he was able to carry on exit. Like, I mean, you're talking at that point, just real quality drivers, and especially too with the changing conditions, like what they raced in Heat 2, completely different from Heat 3, completely different from the final. So, you're having to kind of make these micro adjustments to driving style in every session. And again, for a guy like Garrison that grew up in Florida, that has a lot of laps around a place like Ocala, a place like Orlando, where it's going to have a good amount of rain sessions, that comes naturally. It comes more naturally, right? For a guy like AJ that has been so good in the rain in shifter, it's something you can kind of adjust to and acclimate to as the driver as to exactly where the kart is limited, because that dictates the style ultimately. And the way that the weather happened to be in the finals, and especially I'd say for 2/3 of the weekend, was more of a rear limited situation where you wanted to maximize roll speed, where the front wasn't quite as important, where you could afford to kind of be a little bit more reserved on entry to the corner. But again, it's all in the details. It's all stylistic. And like Kaleb mentioned too, on the tire front, like there's going to be differences. And some of it could be down to the tire availability. Some of it could be down to the tire pressure. Like I know in the final for X30, the tires that were worn out, like extremely, like when you have tires that wear that quickly in a track that evolves by 3 seconds, pressure becomes so important. If you're running at 6 or 7 pounds of air, like I know that some people have done in the past when it's a drying track versus 10 or 11 pounds, that affects when you hit the cliff. That affects the temperature, the thermal deg of it. And I think you're going to see like there's more to the tire fall off than meets the eye. And I don't know, for me as like an enthusiast of rain racing and seeing kind of how I guess diverse the strategies were, how diverse people attacked it, I felt like was a real welcome sight to see this weekend.
Well, that's a great point, right? And that's what we're going to get into here because to me, the coolest part of this entire weekend, maybe the actual product of side-by-side action was not there like it would be on a dry track at Newcastle, but that's to be expected. But the coolest part was the, diverse lines that we saw throughout the day, especially on the Saturday, more than the Sunday because the Sunday was just a continuously dry racetrack, like drying racetrack. But it was the only time they ever saw the track besides the warm up. But on the Saturday, when you have happy hour, we had qualifying because it was moved to the Saturday, and then you had 3 heats. And I would argue, and I think it's almost objective, that every single session was a different conditioned racetrack. Because when Kaleb and I were announcing that, at some points we were saying, "Oh, the track's drying," and it got to that crossover point where qualifying KA Junior slicks. Travis Pettit put on slicks, the first driver to put on slicks that it actually worked for. He puts it on pole provisionally, then 15 more drivers beat him in the next group. We had slicks qualifying for 2 sessions, and then rains for the first couple of heats, and then it poured for heat 2, and then it got drier at the end of heat 2, and then it poured again for heat 3. You had no idea what the conditions were going to be every lap, let alone every race you went out there, every single lap. So that's why setup-wise, Garrison, they figured it out, but you still, like Emory said, you don't really know pressure-wise, especially on a drying track, it is a complete toss-up. But on an ever-changing racetrack, it is so tough to get it all correct, and that's why you emphasize not only for one on like a random practice day. To me, it is so important to go out there and drive in the rain if you get the chance to, because if this ever happens, like you want to be prepared for it. But I think it really emphasizes the outlap, right? Like usually on the outlap, your main priority is get heat the tires, and just get into that window, right, for the opening lap. In the rain, that's less of an importance and more of you got to go out there and find grip, right? Go figure out. You'll see a lot of the top level drivers do this on that outlap is drive into the puddle, see what happens, right? Because there is a baseline rain line, just like there is a baseline racing line, but sometimes that rain line will shift, like we saw in the X30 main event, where like Kyle mentioned on the broadcast. Listen, this is like a dirt race. We had a bunch of grooves out there because it was a drying racetrack. So when we get into the X30 pros, right, they did a really good job of exploring the track. So this was the main event, and already on the snapshot, this was a half-hearted move from Brandon Carr, but it was also one of those things where I just thought it was awesome to see a driver 4 corners into a main, the only one to touch the bottom of the racetrack, turn 5, and see if it worked. Clearly didn't work. Bad exit. Naturally going to happen when you dive into a corner that quick, right? So what does he do? He goes to the cell tower and tries the same thing, a move on Ingrata. It's not going to work. It's going to ruin your exit, right? We heard AJ say it on the interview. A lot of drivers opt for that type of driving style, especially when you're making a pass. You're going to save 30 feet of racetrack on the entry, and you're going to lose 2 times on the exit because you're going to get terrible roll speed. Maybe you can't get traction. And so Brandon Carr figured that out the hard way. So what do? We climb the hill, as we see Harley Keeble as well, going for a half-hearted move, but still exploring racetracks. The 2 Brits were the only ones the first 3 laps that I think diverse themselves from the normal rain line because, one, you're further back in the field than you probably would have liked, and so it's worth taking the risk. But 2, you go out there and on turn-in, it's going to feel amazing. And then you get to that crossover point, especially if you get the break point wrong, you get the turn-in point wrong, you get to that crossover point where all of a sudden you cross over the racing line, and it's going to feel very slick before you get back onto the racing line, right? Onto the rain line, should I say. So you turn into green corner, and at this point, Brandon Carr probably feels like, I found the line, guys. and then you get to that point where it's fully slick, massive understeer because you hit that really slick spot, which is where all the rubber would have been on the racing line. And then Ingrata can just hold the outside, pull away, and it allows Massimino to get on his inside, right? So clearly, at this stage in the main, it is not the right line. You get to
This is the heat though. This is heat one.
This is heat one. Sorry, this is heat one. Yeah. So I was gonna get to that. 'Cause like, this is a little bit too wet for the main. You get this is the first heat, which is actually, it's good that you corrected me there, because this was actually the first session they had since the practice on Friday in the wet, because it was damp for happy hour and dry for their qualifying. So this is actually their first. This was their first wet session since Friday practice, and they only got 2 of them, right? So this is a brand new racetrack. So for Brandon Carr to go out there and just try it lap 1, that takes some guts, right? So now we're on lap 3. Everyone's doing the normal rain line here. Harley Keeble decides, I saw Brandon Carr attempt this 2 laps ago. Didn't work. Let's try something here. Let's go into turn number 2. Turn in ultra early. And we'll get into this. And Emory, I'll go to you first, because we talked about it in the green room before the show. There's a couple of ways to make this move stick. So why don't you walk us through exactly what Harley's doing in the situation to make this happen?
Yeah, so first off, he comes into the corner, and he knows he's at this point right on Bonilla's tail. He commits to this move basically at the time that he gets past the rumble strip on exit of turn 1. He'll have probably thought about making this move 2-3 corners in advance, because he knows that he'll have a line in a corner where the rain line is basically squaring off both turn 2 and turn 3. You go straight into 2, late apex it, very wide, run straight out to the outside of turn 3, square it, and you're going to run basically a base rain line. And so what Harley sees is where Carr made the move into green corner, there was a long straightaway after that, right? There was a long corner or a long exit where you can't slot in. You're going to get crossed over. The guy in front of, or the guy that is in front of you coming into the corner is going to have much better momentum. It's a lot harder to make that move. So what Keeble does is he commits to the curb right here. He already started the turn in, which normally is a ridiculously early turn in. You never see someone pass into turn 2 in the dry. And if you're going to make that move, you're also not going to turn in that early. But because of the way that his trajectory works, he commits to the turn in as early as possible, gets to the curb before Bonilla really gets to his apex point, maybe slightly afterwards, but still he's already on the curb, launched towards the racing line by the time Bonilla's apex the corner. And so because of that, he can slide in front of him, intersect the racing line. And even though he loses a couple tenths on the exit and has that understeer, he's able to basically intersect the racing line, get in front, and it's a slow enough corner, long enough apex that he can do that. He can get away with that jump and come out in front and then be able to take the next corner pretty much usually, and there's nothing Bonilla can do to counter it. So this was a good example of Keeble turning in really early, committing to the curb, committing to the pass, finding an area where he can make it done. This was not as good of an example. Nick Terlecki realizes, commits to the pass, he sends it into the corner. Similar to Keeble, he's opting for kind of that intersect the line slide job, so to speak. Only in Terlecki's case, he doesn't commit to the move till right here, which is not that far ahead of the normal turn end point. And so what that does, he's braking, he's sending into the corner while he's also turning down and going across the rubber. So not only is he braking later than you normally would in the rain, he's also braking on a suboptimal line with kind of a crossing the rubber point. And so when you do that, when you hit the brakes right there and you release, it is going to have no grip and he's going to slide straight off the track. So instead of doing what Keeble did, which was commit to the turn end point some 10 feet earlier, where you can aggressively attack the curb, he's missed that curb. He's missed the optimal braking point where you would want to try to send it in on a non-rubbered line. And instead, he's basically crossed the rubber, slid it wide. And again, there was maybe some room to make that pass, because the run from turn 1 to turn 2 is definitely longer than from 2 to 3. But if he's going to try to make that pass, he had to have committed to it some 5 or 10 feet earlier, got into the curb, and then tried to intersect Pauly's line, which, again, risky pass. Obviously didn't end up well for him. He ends up in the grass, but the thinking was there. But if you're going to make that move, you got to do it a bit earlier, like Keeble did, and did so effectively. So it's two moves with a similar kind of concept of trying to slide in front of the racing line and clear, kind of box the guy out, so to speak. But Keeble did it, I'd say, at a better corner and with a much better turn and angle.
Yeah, and I think I think Simon can really attest to this as well. This weekend was one of the biggest things, with just how characteristic Newcastle is known for a very different rail line. And Simon, I mean, what actually is the rail line around Newcastle? Because it's obviously that you have the Rhino liner in like throughout the cracks on the racetrack, so like people struggle to kind of find that happy medium of like what's too wide, or like what's too narrow and whatnot.
Well, if you look at all the clips we've seen, most of the field is running this high, wide line around the corner, and it's all this balance. You see Norberg on an excellent crossover there, getting back behind the rubber. It's finding out where that dry line rubber is, and it's not going to be the same every time because it's all weather dependent. Every time the conditions change, you're always looking for new things. It's the beauty of rain racing, is it's never the same twice. You can take general characteristics from it, but basically, especially in karting, you're looking for crossover points in the rubber. All right, when am I going to hit the rubber? When I do, keep my hands straight, turn when I'm offline, off the rubber, and as soon as I cross back over, hands straight again. And you see a lot of people doing this. And one neat thing about the passes we were talking about down to the inside, like Brandon Carr's, is that when you do it, if you can hook it right on that inside line, the neat part about his pass in turn 2 is if you look at where his kart placement was, he hooks the left sides inside that elevated curb on the inside. And that's what was missed in that pass into turn 4. Not only did you miss the curb there, you slid across the rubber line with wheel input and pedal input in the kart. And that's always going to upset the kart. But if you can do it where you hook the inside of that curb, the natural thing is to say, curbs are not great for rain racing. I personally love them because especially with an elevated curb, if you can hook the inside of it, it's going to help that kart rotate. And that's certainly what happened with that move. He knew he was going to do a slide job, and he prepped the entry so that he could get massively inside, like you talked about. He turned in really, really early to get that move done. And by doing that, gets into that grass there. And that grass being inside that curb is going to help hook that kart around and give him that mid corner he needs to not go flying off the exit where we see into the turn 4 pass that it clearly just, it was a bit deep, a bit ambitious, and you couldn't quite get it stopped in time. So with the rain line at Newcastle, you're playing a guessing game, and it's different whether you're running by yourself or you're worrying about other karts around you. It's always different, but you're just looking for those crossover points in the rubber and where, if there's a curb you can use. And if you're going to run an inside line, make sure you don't have a long straight in front of you. Make sure you're prepping the exits for those long straights. And if you're going to try anything, make sure you've got, a narrow, short straight where you saw that turn 2, turn 3 move. It's, a very, very short run from turn 2 to turn 3. So you hop the curb, complete the slide job, and know you're not going to die on the exit because you're immediately prepping for the next corner. So it's a very interesting dynamic you go through here because you have a lot of corners. A lot of them look similar, but the difference is what's it lead to. And that's where, as a driver, you're going to try and analyze and pick your moves throughout the race.
What can you tell us about what Brandon Carr is doing in this situation compared to everybody else? Like, is this a style of driver that you are when it's raining?
Well, I can tell you he's British. That's for one. I've raced plenty of British drivers in my life, and you always have to worry about them in the rain, right? They have so much experience with the weather conditions over in England. This is fairly typical. So I love to see him exploring the lines. It's great to see in there again with Harley Keeble, another driver from across the pond. You're looking, you're exploring, you're trying to figure out what works, and you're doing this early in the race so you can figure out what's going to work, especially in a long event. You can give up a corner or two in the beginning if you can find something worth, a couple tenths of a second. If you can find that, you can make it work. Then if you're the only one doing it, you're in for a good ride the rest of the time. So I love the idea of exploring the limits and trying different lines, seeing what works. And that's always the battle of what you're trying to do in the rain. If I go back to, we had a pretty good rain race at my last event in Portland. I think DeTulio was in that one as well. And I was getting calls mid-race over the radio from some very experienced drivers who were spotting for me, who would identify if someone found something. Okay, they found that. Let me go try it. Let me see how this works. Does it work for me? And in that case, it did. It worked very, very well. So you continue to do that for the rest of the race. Just exploring and deviating from the standard approach. Because if you stay on the standard approach, you're probably not going to make too much ground. If everyone's doing the same thing, you're probably going to sit where you are. So I really like the approach of exploring and finding those limits.
At what point in a race does the reward almost outweigh the risk? Where you're in Garrison's situation, right? You're leading the race. You're probably less. You want to take less risks when you're the leader versus being a guy that's in Brandon Carr's situation at this point, sitting in 5th or 6th. You're confident in your abilities to drive in the wet. I mean, is there a certain point in a race where it's not worth taking the risk?
I mean, that depends on both the race situation and the championship outlook. With Garrison, you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to go get a championship this week, and you're probably going to take a few less risks. And just to go back to Portland one more time, we saw that in race 1. Lockie, fantastic driver. He was being very, very measured in his approach. Let's just get it across the line, get that title secured. And we had some very good runs on my end in that race, but we ended up turning the same lap time. And our difference in position was just, the approach of, I'm not in the title fight. I can go and try and win this thing. Whereas if you're, conscious about points and you want to get it across the line to take that title, you're going to be a little bit more measured, as we saw Garrison. And that's something that's, I'd expect from someone like Austin Garrison. We've raced far back as early as 2011, 2012 together. He's a driver I have immense respect for, a very, very talented driver. And obviously, like you all mentioned, very glad to see him get a national title in there. But the way you do that is by being very considerate and being forward thinking of, okay, what risk do I take here? And we saw Garrison, with all the pace he had, get into that lead and say, okay, I'm out in the lead now. Let's get it. We're not going to go slow, but we're not going to do anything unnecessary just because we can.
Emory, I'll give this to you here because I know you have a little bit of input to say about what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I just want to say again, it's all in the small details too. And like Simon mentioned, kind of hunting out those areas, hearing the input of like what worked and what didn't. That would be something that these guys like Norberg that have teammates in different sport classes or Garrison will have heard about that. And the other thing too is I've been watching this clip between Norberg and Pauly, and different from really both Terlecki and Keeble. You see Pauly again earlier into the turn in, commits to the curve earlier. As such, he still missed the corner, was still a little bit ambitious, but he was able to slide in front, hamper Norberg's run a little bit. And then on Norberg's approach as well, you can see again the pass commitment that he makes into turn 2, where he's at a better spot compared to Pauly than what Keeble was, but he takes the turn in at a normal angle, doesn't commit to the curb, doesn't really commit to the early like turn and braking point, and as such misses the curve. He's on the inside the normal racing line, which in X30 doesn't really utilize the curb, and he just slides wide. He doesn't have much forward traction. So even though Pauly overdrove that turn 1 pass slightly, because Norberg didn't turn in early into the curb and didn't quite have the momentum to slide forward in front of Pauly, it meant that Pauly's pass was a net gain on that. So again, it's just the small differences. One of which we saw with Terlecki, where he just kind of turned in a bit too late into the corner, lost too much momentum, slid wide. He basically put the go-kart in a complete bind with that pass attempt between the wheel input going across rubber as well as the brake input across rubber. Keeble on the curb early, let the cart roll over the curb, slide in front of the racing line, essentially a slide job. And then with Norberg and Pauly, kind of a little bit of the lesser version of both of those, you saw Pauly was able to get away with that turn 1 pass, even though it wasn't optimal. So that racecraft is definitely one side of the equation. There's a lot that we could go into, but I think it's time we talk about some more details about the weekends.
Yeah, well, there's one more clip here that I want to show you guys, and this is, like I was mentioning, so this is the clips from the main events, where this X30 Junior main, to me, was the beginning of the transition point to a dry racetrack. I still think slicks wouldn't have worked. We'll get into the X30 Senior main, where I think slicks would have worked if you can fire them up in time. But we'll start this move from Charlie Smith on the blue National Motorsports machine through Cell Tower. This is a move that we saw all weekend long, and it worked, I'd say 50% of the time, because in this sort of corner where you intercept that racing line, you got to dive it in super early. You see Charlie Smith begins his turn in. He doesn't even set up for the corner, right? He doesn't even set back up on the right-hand side of the racetrack. He basically goes middle of the track, begins his turn in so much earlier than Scarborough does. And so this is what we're talking about with how Keeble made that move stick and how Pauly was able to make the move work versus what Trelecky did. But the issue that we saw in South Tower throughout the weekend was when you turn in so early, you intersect that racing line, you get a big understeer push, or you have to severely slow the entry to the corner down so you don't understeer into the person. That on your exit, either they'll just rip the top around the outside, or we saw a move with Carr earlier on in the other clip where you make the move stick and then you get crossed over. But in this case, this was the biggest sign to me when Kaleb and I were announcing this race that the dry line is starting to form. That move looked fairly simple, and it's not a simple move to make because you can see Charlie Smith. The reason why I highlighted this move over other ones is this is as far back as I saw this move be done. This is 3 to 4 cart length back from Scarborough.
Yeah, and I'm not, and also just to add like a real quick point, one of the big things that I noticed, like on moves like that was like an over under corner as well. Like in the previous heat races or the previous races, Scarborough would have easily over undered him if it was a lot wetter. So I think that's when we started to notice, like, all right, this track is starting to dry because Scarborough cannot like over under Charlie Smith in this corner. Like it just shows you how dry it's starting to get out there.
It was a well executed move though, right? Like I still think the crossover could have happened, but Charlie Smith held the go-kart down on the middle of the racetrack, right? So he did a really good job of, full lock. So he's still using the fronts to help slow the cart down more than the brakes, but he maintained speed middle of the corner. And so even if Scarborough wanted to just put the hammer down and do the crossover, he did a really good job of holding her on the outside and forcing her to stay there. But I do think, like you mentioned, this was an alarming thing for me watching this race of, okay, we have a dry line starting to form. This next move, I think, is slightly more borderline on if it was dry, this probably is, frustrating, at least. I'm not going to say penalty or not, but I think in the wet, this is one of those moves where there's a little more leniency, and you heard me say it a lot on the on the broadcast of drivers using up another driver, right? Where we heard AJ and Austin mention it in their interviews when they were on the broadcast with us during the live stream of, okay, the best way to pass somebody in the wet is around the outside. The issue is they're going to be, if you're passing somebody on the outside, that means they're on your inside. Naturally, you're going to get a big understeer moment, especially if the track is wet, right? So usually you have to do, I don't want to say this exact tactic, but this is what you saw a lot of the weekend. This is a little bit more of an exaggerated version of it, but Vidmontien, this is about halfway through this main event, into a corner that's flat or close to flat in the dry, pretty much flat, actually, I think in every class, basically. In the wet, this is a very sketchy corner. And Vidmontien turns in early, commits to the curb. Wolny holds the outside and has the preferred line. But the issue is when you get to that point where Vidmontien gets a major understeer moment, he has nowhere to go but to use Wolny as not a break because there's no contact, but you use the guy up. You force Wolny to back out of it. So to me, this is one of those things, and I want to hear your opinion on it. And I'll start with you, Simon, on this is probably a karting only rain move. I think in a car situation, maybe with non-open wheels, is a little bit more of a common move, but there's a risk obviously in an open wheel style move. But what's your take on the idea of using a guy up almost in the rain?
I have two different takes depending on which driver I am in the situation. If I'm the one making that move, all for it. If I'm the one getting past there, it's fair play. If that's, I'm not saying that's anything wrong with that type of racing at all. But now you've opened the door that, that could potentially happen back. If I was going to go in and, 100% stay off of everybody, and then, we have a move like that, then if I have the pace to get back there, I'm probably going to make that same type of move. And if I'm in Vidmontien's spot in the first place and I have that kind of pace and I just get to the front as quick as possible, then yeah, fair play. Let's go for it. I've nothing wrong with that move. The one thing that I can point out from a driving standpoint is that he may have clipped that curb a bit of aggressively and might have caught him off guard a little bit. With how much, when the cart settled back down, how much wider he would have run off the exit there. And as someone who's been racing cars, I don't think Vidmontine would necessarily make that move in the open wheel USF ranks, but I think it's all fine here. I have no problem with it.
Emory?
Yeah, I mean, like Simon said, it depends on what side you're on. If you're Woney, you probably look at it like, hey, you raced me aggressive. The next lap, if I have the pace to get back up, I'm going to do the exact same thing. And, it's a bit like rules of war, rules of any sort of sport. Once you see one person kind of bend the line a little bit, you go to that same line and you go to that same point and you recognize that, hey, this is fair game. This is what we're going to do. But in the rain in general, I think you have to recognize, especially in a go-kart, like ultimately there's such an advantage to the rain line, to the optimal racing line in these conditions that you have to get your elbows out for a pass, whether it be committing the curve super early like we saw from Keeble, or kind of getting your side pods out, being willing to make that contact, to make that pass like we saw with Enzo. I don't think it was something that was worthy of a penalty by any means. I also think if you're a Jackson Woney, you'd be like, hey, well, next time I get in that situation, I'm going to race the exact same way. So it's all fair game. I do think that it was maybe a little bit unintentionally sloppy on Vidmontien's part because, like Simon kind of alluded to, you get on that curve, you realize, man, like this kind of brought me out further than I would have expected to. At that point, you're committed to the overtake. You're committed to the move. I don't think you have much of a choice. So, like I said, I mean, maybe not the most perfectly executed move, but it's never going to be perfect in the rain. You're going to have to get the elbows out. You're going to have to kind of take some risks and make some, not enemies, but make a few less friends out there.
Brandon Carr is probably, if not my favorite, one of my favorite rain drivers to watch. He's a Brit, so he's been in the rain quite a bit. We saw whenever it rains, usually he's the driver that we look at and say that guy is going to win the race. We saw him be really quick this past over at the Winter Series when it rained at Homestead. He was pretty quick when it rained at Trackhouse, and then now you have a situation where this is the main event on a drying racetrack. So this was early on in this race where we're still at that point. You're seeing drivers use the rain line, which is at Newcastle right above that seam, right? You want to stay out of that black seam in the middle of the racetrack because it's like black ice, right? It's basically paint. It's rubber. That's what it is. And it becomes very slick if you do a middle of the racetrack style line. So that's why you'll see some drivers opt for that bottom of the racetrack, dive it in hard, and use the fronts to brake, and it kills your exit. Whereas if you do the top side, you can have a nice and smooth, rotation throughout the corner. That's Garrison's route, and it worked for him up until this drying racetrack. I think that's the one thing that caught Austin out. It looked like they missed the setup slightly, probably missed the pressures. But to me, I didn't see Austin explore all too often versus what we saw with Alexa Brandon Carr in the situation where you're watching him. This is early on in this race, already turning in earlier than Terlecki. It's not working for him, but he's trying it. Turn 3. We saw him do this early on in the show, but this is as drastic as anybody's done it. You see Ryan's coming from the high side. Terlecki is not even in frame with how early Brandon Carr turns into this corner. Uses the curve for rotation, and at this point, it's worked for him. He's actually gotten a better exit than Terlecki, and this move works because it's followed immediately by a left-hander turn 4. So what does he do? The exact same situation into 4. You kind of use up Terlecki a little bit, but that's part of rain racing. And to me, it's just one of those situations where you got to appreciate a driver that explores different parts of the line. Kaleb, I'll start with you here. What stands out to you when watching Brandon Carr drive in the rain?
I mean, I really think you said it best on the broadcast. He was the first guy that was kind of trying things. And this is, I would say, kind of what we saw at the World Championships in Europe, like 2 weeks ago. Everybody was kind of going low and hitting the curbs and using that technique to kind of get around a racetrack that was a lot more wet than this. But I mean, I really have nothing much to kind of say than to what we're seeing. You're trying different things, trying to see what works, trying to see what doesn't. And some corners and some instances it worked for Brandon Carr. And I believe this is the main event. So, it was working out for him. And in some of them, did he cook up his tires maybe a little too soon? That's also another thing because we saw how much degradation was also going on with everything. So, going into a corner hard could have been due to the degradation. But, our respect to all these guys that they were tested this weekend for sure, probably more than they have been all year long. So huge respect to all of them driving pretty much on on wet tires on a dry racetrack here. And Alex, I also think we kind of talked about, what it would have been like if some of these guys opted to go on slicks. Here, I think for Brandon Carr, a guy who, has nothing to lose in this situation, go out there on slicks. You're going to lose a whole lot at the start, but as the racetrack continues to progress, you're going to be wicked quick and probably going to win this race in the end.
I agree. I was actually surprised. If there's any driver that I thought would have made the gamble, was Brandon Carr. For a driver that had a down weekend and just seemingly couldn't get out of his own way luck-wise, I thought this was the race to go on slicks. Hindsight's 2020, right? Because I do agree with the Tulio's point when we interviewed him after the race of you would have lost a lot of time at the beginning. I think the first 5 or 6 laps you would have been 4 to 5 seconds slower. But I also think the last 6 or 7 laps you would have been 4 to 5 seconds faster. So if you could have fired those tires up and just minimized your loss at the start, it would have worked. Now, I don't want to get into too much hypothetical situations because we'll never really know, but I do think after, especially looking at Austin Olds' tires when he came into the pits, and he was just one of the many drivers, and Olds was actually purple the last 3 laps in that main event. We had a really good shot of it. It was a slick tire. I mean, there was maybe a couple of grooves on the outer edge of the tire, but it was slick. It was basically it was a less grippy slick tire. With how dry that racetrack became, the tire just completely chunked up. Now, I want to get back into this portion of the Brandon Carr situation, where this is one of the more like badass portions of this race to me, where it's a drying racetrack. Carr just made an awesome move on Terlecki, and now he's the one leading this group. And at this point, Brandon Carr is the first one to explore parts of the racetrack, right? Or at least one of the first ones to explore new parts of the racetrack that others are just not willing to risk right now. I think this plays into the point of how difficult it is to be the leader of a group or just the leader in general in a rain or a wet situation versus being a guy in second where you have nothing to lose, right? You're watching the guy in front of you, and if he does a line that's quicker than you, okay, well, the next lap you try his line. But if his line stinks and you go out there and figure out a better racing line like Brandon Carr just figured out with the curb, then now all of a sudden, if you're Terlecki, you're Massimino, you just watch Brandon Carr make that move on you. What line are you going to try next lap? You're probably going to go to the curb in 3. You're probably going to go to the curb in 4. And then this is where all of a sudden, like Kyle, who joined us in Indianapolis booth, said we had almost a dirt-style racetrack going on. We had so many grooves because all of a sudden so many drivers are doing different lines. It's washed. That's why all of a sudden we got this dry line out of nowhere, or dry line. Right? Because we just evacuated so much water so quickly during this Xfinity Pro race. It was awesome to see. I think this double right here pretty much signifies exactly what I'm talking about. You have Carr, middle of the racetrack. You have Terlecki at the bottom. And you have Massimino trying this big high side move in the double right. So 3 different lines for one corner. And it all equals basically the same results, right? Carr got a better exit because he got the power down sooner than everybody else. All of a sudden, you're watching this. Massimino just saw Brandon Carr make the inside move into 4. And so that's all of a sudden telling you, okay, this dry line's forming. We saw Charlie Smith do it 2 races ago in the Nash Motorsports machine. So now we're in Cell Tower corner. Massimino says, you know what? Why not? Goes to the bottom of the racetrack, and actually for a moment gets a 2-for-1. And like Kaleb said, this is one of the corners where it really opens up the crossover opportunity, right? So Brandon Carr stopped the cart on a dime enough to get a crossover. This is still a net gain of 1 spot for Massimino. So it's a profitable move to go for it. And that this signified, okay, we're starting at a dry line. So we enter green corner. Brandon Carr, again, the only driver, and he had no reason to do this because there's no reason to defend in this corner, to try this line other than you're trying something. He turns in, full steering wheel lock. He misses the curb, and that actually hurts him on the exit here. And that's how Paulie got such a good run, right? Because like Simon said in the show earlier, if you turn in early, you better get to that curb. Or if you miss it, you're going to slide up the racetrack too much. But if you get to that curb, you hook the inside tire in that curb. And now at Newcastle, there's a little bit less of a lip to hook your tire on, but it's usable. And Carr misses the curb. You get a good exit from Massimino. And you go to the bottom here in green corner. Move done. Paulie just got 2 spots in 3 corners because of the dry line that formed. And Emory, I'll start with you here. How difficult, I mean, obviously we were not in the driver's seat, but how difficult do you think this was for these drivers to have to try new lines, especially as somebody. Let me re-ask that here. For Brandon Carr, for example, who just made all his moves stick, he's the first guy to try all this. How much tougher is it to now be the leader of your group, and now everybody else behind you can try stuff, and really you almost can't?
Man, I mean, racing in a drying track has got to be one of the most, I guess, humbling experiences that you can have as a karting driver, because you can go from being the fastest guy on the racetrack at the start of a race to 6, 7 laps later, people adapt quicker than you. They find the line. And it's one of the coolest things I felt like about how Carr was attacking this race is he never stopped trying different approaches. He never got complacent. And, there's going to be things that work one lap that 3 laps earlier aren't working, and kind of finding that grip, finding that level. It's really difficult to consistently be good at every facet of what you do, because naturally the guys that are good at finding the limits better or finding the areas to push are going to have to struggle for a lap or so to kind of find that area. And if you want to find kind of that last little bit of performance like a car is trying to do here, you've got to be willing to take those risks. And naturally as a driver, you're bound to trying to do what you've seen work throughout the laps. You're bound to trying to stay on that rain line maybe a little bit too long. And I think that in races like these, the decision making, the kind of thought process behind when can I try this, when can I trust that at some point it's going to work, that is what separates the good rain racing drivers and the best ones, to be honest with you. And I had a question for Simon on this, because Simon alluded to that race in Portland, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Simon, but early in that race, you guys were, what was it, like 5 to 6 seconds off of what the ultimate pace would be. So you kind of had a drying track in a sense, and maybe not quite to the degree of being fully on slicks, but it certainly seemed like the pace, the lines were different from that point. And I want to know, how hard was it for you to A, kind of experiment, and B, sort of keep yourself in the right mindset of keeping the tires alive like you were able to do? Because ultimately you fell back a decent ways from the top two, but by the end of the race, you were almost on the gearbox to winning that race had there been another lap.
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, drying track, in my opinion, way easier to figure out than when it's getting wetter. When more rain's coming down, you go into a corner, you don't know if it's going to stick, but when there's no more rainfall and you're left with the same conditions, the track will improve as the session goes on. So it gives you some confidence to build on. Obviously, if you're getting to the point where you have a long enough race, a soft enough tire, then yeah, you're worried about when that tire is going to start to fall off. That was the story of our race in Portland. But mainly it's about, trusting in what you're doing, starting to figure out, okay, this lap, maybe I tried something, maybe it didn't quite work yet, but 2-3 laps from now, now that I've tried it, I have a good feeling of what the grip was. Maybe it's coming to me, and you can start that farther exploration of those racing lines. And that's what I thought was really impressive about that drive from Brandon Carr, is that ability to just go and say, okay, the whole race, we're not taking any corner for granted. And maybe, to a bit of an extreme degree of playing with the lines, but especially with we replayed a move of his with his turn-in point for turn 2 and the pass he made subsequently into turn 4 of that was one thing I wanted to hit on with that, is he turned into the corner on that Rhino liner into turn 2, and it didn't quite work there, but then he did it again in 3, started to work a little better. Okay, it was better through that corner. Now this time in 4, he doesn't completely dry line it. He still runs almost a rain line where he's half track, but now that he's tried those middle grooves and he's found some semblance of grip, he has this confidence to be able to say, okay, I can stick this move here. I don't even have to go to the curb. I know I'm going to have grip because the track's improving and I'm the only driver doing the exploring.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, confidence is key in rain racing, and I agree with what Emory and Simon said of it's humbling to drive on a drying racetrack, but I also think, like Simon said, it's a lot easier.
Oh yeah,
because
I should
the
have
confidence.
rephrased that.
Well, no, because it is humbling, because if you're Brandon Carr, you're the first one to probably find the grip, but if you don't continue to adapt, you can get outdriven. Whereas, like Simon was saying, on a track that gets more wet, it's much easier to lose confidence than gain it, and it's it's easier said than done of, go out there and try stuff when it's raining harder
Well,
than when it's drying up.
yeah, driving on a progressively wetter track is more like playing roulette, whereas driving on a drier track, it's not to say there's not strategy in driving on a wetter track, but there definitely is more strategic variance that you can actually like go towards on a drying track.
100 on red. That's it.
Didn't go so well.
Personally, I think with the conditions, like you said, it's a coin toss when it's more rain's falling. It's okay. How much confidence am I going to have? It's a confidence game. Whereas when it's a drying track, it's more of a cognitive game of thinking about what the track's going to be like in the future. How much can I explore here, there? So it's just two different sides of the coin, and neither are easy. Don't get me wrong on that. It's definitely very, very difficult, and that's why I personally really enjoy that rain racing. It provides that level of variance, of really having to go and figure it out. You're not just muscle memory on the racing lines, in the dry, but you're really trying to figure everything out. And that's what brings out the best in some drivers, and especially why I really enjoyed watching Brandon Karts drive there.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't have said it better myself. So that being said, that's going to conclude our rain racing talk. We're going to hear a quick word from our sponsor at AKR, and then we'll get into a quick segment that the reason why we brought Simon on the show in the first place. But because we had Simon, I figured bring him in for an analyst point. But now we'll get into the Karts versus car situation after this quick commercial break.
Brandon, why are there all these charges for just over $200 from Acceleration Kart Racing's website?
That's because AKR gives you free shipping on orders of $200 or more within the continental US.
Okay, but I thought you were just getting a pair of gloves. That's what, $70?
But if I'm getting a new pair of gloves, I might as well get a new pair of shoes to match. And then on top of that, I'll get a neck brace because with the shipping, it's basically free.
Yeah, I do not think the math checks out on that.
Everything you need, all in one place and shipped to your door for free for orders of $200 or more. Exclusions apply. Spend responsibly. Shop AKR.com.
Welcome back to Grid Talk Tuesday, episode number 29. Kaleb Vieska is still here. I want to bring him on for a second here. I know Kaleb may have to go in a little bit, but we never got a chance to do this. So I thought, why not bring this comment up right now?
Stop.
I think you showed it last episode, but if not,
yeah, no, I didn't.
For those who don't know, at the TSRS race 2 weeks ago, he put out a bit of a goal for people to go out there and if what was it? Was it $1,000, Kaleb?
Yeah, it was $1,000.
If he sold $1,000 by the end of the day on the Friday,
wave check.
He buzzed his hair. And well, we hit the goal, and I gotta say, he got a haircut. That wasn't a buzz. That's a haircut. And
Keep the hat on, man.
I think it looks pretty good. I want to shout out Rocco Rusic, by the way, who's he's co-announcer for TSRS, and he's one of our main camera guys on national weekends. He actually buzzed his hair, so shout out Rocco Rusic. But nonetheless, good. That was a cool moment there, Kaleb.
Yeah, it was cool, for sure. Not as cool as having Sikes on the show. So,
well, let's get into that, right, Simon? I mean, you're here. We're gonna talk about the transition, I'd say, karts to cars, but rather than just saying what it takes to get there. The main thing that I want to get into you with is what routes, first of all, did you take to get to where you're at from karts?
I'm racing a lot of the guys that we see in your current pro national scene in karting currently, whether it be Frankie Mossman, DeTulio, a bunch of others are jumping onto the ladder that I'm competing on the USF Pro Championships. But I definitely had an interesting route getting here. Maybe a little bit more unique than most because, I stopped full-time karting in, I want to say 2014. It's a decade now. From there, I went to the Skid Barber Racing School, did a couple of their school programs, and then ran their series for a full year, did their championship series. And from there, the goal was always end up in the formal road to Indy, now the USF Pro Championships, with the aim at IndyCar. as many drivers in the U.S. Aspire to do. It's in my opinion, the best development you can get. We have a lot of fantastic drivers running, but the obvious main hindrance of getting there is funding. So I took my time, not voluntarily, but I went and competed in the F1600 Championship Series, the F2000 Championship Series with Formula Race Promotions. I competed in the SCCA runoffs, and I ran there for a long time up until 2020, where I won the F1600 Championship. And then I got my first opportunity in USF 2000 with Murati Autosport and Legacy Autosport. Very grateful to those guys for giving me the opportunity, but that was kind of my first introduction into the Road to Indy, as it was named then. But I came up through, the same karting ranks, the same series that we just watched. USPKS was one of my favorite karting series to run. So I grew up doing that from the age of 5 up until I was about 14 years old. Then I went into the open wheel route with Skip Barber, F1600s, and really finding good development in those Formula 4 cars. I really enjoyed racing those before I made the step into the Road to Indy, where I competed in USF 2000. I did a couple of partial seasons before I was able to string together a full season ride last year with Pabst Racing. And, fortune was on our side. We were able to secure the championship, which allowed me to continue and move up into USF Pro2000 this year, which has been the past season that I ran, which ironically, I ran against Frankie Mossman, Alessandro Di Tullio, a lot of the guys that we're seeing in the Kart Chaser broadcast week in and week out. So it's been a lot of fun racing those guys, and, everyone takes different routes, but it's funny. We all end up back in the same place, it seems.
I think it's safe to say that there is not one specific path that a driver should or can take. But I want to get into a couple of things. So I think in karting, right, there's a reason why drivers get into karting. You learn the basics. You learn the line, you learn racecraft, and it's a really affordable way. It's the most affordable way compared to car racing to get into it all, right? Especially if you get it, once you get into national level karting and you choose the entire, if you want to do all 3 nationals and then you do testing and all that, but it can get costly. But if you have a direct path and you have a goal and an end goal of where you want to end up, karting is by far the most efficient way to spend your money and get the most amount of laps for your dollar. But I want to talk about, you stopped karting about a decade ago. How much of a similarity is it to car racing? And how much of what's the crossover like? Have you noticed that it's pretty equal, or in some cars, have you driven, it's like, okay, this is different to a kart completely?
Honestly, I found that cars suited me really well. Just getting that weight transfer and being able to feel the roll center of the car was huge for me, being able to really feel that. But just to back up on your point about the cost of karting, whether you do all 3 national series or you're doing rental karts at your local place, the way I did it, I was never, spend the big budget to go racing. It was me and my dad out of the back of a small trailer. We did run in USPKS, WKA in those series, but we did it by ourselves. We were building our own karts. I was on so many different chassis. I can't even count how many different chassis I ran throughout my career, but it was never a factory effort. So we were able to do it at a very low cost, high yield kind of style of development. And I think that karting, like you mentioned, best bang for your buck for laps and experience. And I will go so far as to say this: the best drivers that I ever raced were in karting. The biggest separator when you get to car racing is that you race some of those guys you raced in kartings. The good ones that you race in cars, you raced in karting. At least in my experience, that's been the case. Is now the guys that I'm fighting at the front with are the guys that I grew up karting with, especially for the U.S. guys. Now we have some foreign influence now as well, with very good drivers from other countries that grew up karting in their respective countries. However, I can say wholeheartedly that, karting is where some really, really talented drivers are. I mean, you look at Austin Garrison, Ryan Norberg, a lot of really, really good drivers, and not everyone has the budget to jump to cars. And I feel fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, because I never thought I would make it this far. it was always a question of budget of just how do I get there? And, I just haven't given up on the dream yet. And I don't plan on it anytime soon, but just to hammer in the point of you have a lot of really good guys on these Kart Chaser broadcasts. And those are the guys that I'll be racing in my races. Like we mentioned, I'm racing against a bunch of the Kart Chaser guys now that are on the broadcast, but you have a lot of good talent, good development. And that's why I think karting is such a huge importance. And I love being a part of Kart Chaser to come back and support these programs, give a little spotlight to the guys who previously wouldn't have gotten it, because you're not in a full-fledged race car, you're in a go-kart, but still you've got some of the best drivers in the world, in my opinion.
You mentioned development. I know your path, I think, is, to me, you nailed it on the path that you chose to get to where you're at right now, because you'll see a lot of drivers, whether because they can foot the bill, or because they just feel like they're just ready for that step. I think out of karting, I see too many young kids or parents maybe get persuaded to make the jump towards a big series, whatever it may be, right? To me, even USF 2000 is already a large series to get into, and they struggle maybe that first year because it's such a large jump, right? Because all of a sudden you go from chassis, right, that flexes a little bit, to a full suspension race car with no power steering, and it just feels different. You have downforce, everything's going to feel totally different, versus what you did, which is a less eyes on a series, most similar to me to a go-kart, which is 1600s. And I think ultimately it paid off your development. Would you agree?
Certainly. I mean, the last thing you want to do is jump in the spotlight and underperform. I mean, with the budgets it takes at these levels, you don't really get a whole lot of chances. It's, if you can foot the bill all the way, then great. But, that's very, very few people. And if you don't have that opportunity, you have to make the most of it. So making sure you're ready before you move up is key, in my opinion. I never stepped up to a series before really feeling like I could compete at the front. And that's just got to be my biggest, advice to anybody is it's all shiny and it looks very cool. And, I had the same thoughts when I was 15, 16 years old of, oh man, USF 2000, they've got that fancy steering wheel with the dash in the middle of it. I want to drive that. They got the fancy paddle shifters.
Big wing.
The car looks really cool.
Yeah.
But if you're not ready for it, you're not ready for it. And some people are ready. It's different ages for everybody. My teammate, Max Garcia, did a fantastic job this year. He took a not partial. He had to miss the first event because he wasn't old enough yet. So that just goes to show you how young he was when he got into the USF 2000 category. But he won the championship this year, and he was ready from a young age. He had a lot of preparation in karting, a lot of testing in the car prior to competing. So it's about knowing, okay, am I really ready for this before I fully commit, knowing, spotlight, the bill, everything it takes to be at this level. So advice I have is be ready before you do it. There's no harm in taking a year in doing a repeat just to make sure, okay, I've got what it takes to move up now.
Emory?
Yeah, well, and I was just going to ask, how much do you think that path that you've taken, where it hasn't been sort of the linear rocket ship type of jump up to the top level, but more so kind of you've had seasons where you've had to run a partial season. You've had seasons where maybe the equipment, the testing time wasn't quite there. How much has that helped you kind of grow into the overall package that you are today, where you can kind of have a wider view of this? And I guess sort of understanding sort of the limitations, but also the value and sort of understanding where you're at and what you're capable of going on from there.
Well, I'll be the first to say that I'm not a perfect driver. It's hard to be. I don't think very many people are perfect. It's, that's the everlasting goal, that you're chasing perfection. And, the easiest way to measure that is a championship standings. And I can't say I was perfect this year, but at the end of the day, I'm happy with the progress and development that I've had. And to go back to your point, it's hugely important, I think, for my development, having so many, partial seasons. It hasn't come together. And really that meant that when the times that I got to step in the race car, I had to make the most of it. It was almost every weekend. It was, I don't know if this is going to be my last time in a race car. So we really have to do everything we can to keep pushing. And especially when you're doing in a low budget partial season effort, it made it a lot easier for me when I stepped into the full-time seat at Paps Racing, settling into, a really big operation that's so professionally run. It just made everything so much easier. I've been, fighting an uphill battle. It's like all of a sudden, okay, I've got, all the resources at my disposal to do it properly. And it just gave that level of benefit of perseverance of pushing through, of not having it perfect. And then when you get everything right, it's very satisfying.
Yeah. And so I guess looking back at your karting days as well, I mean, how much did having that sort of experience working with your dad, where you were in sort of fighting against the factory teams, fighting against the guys that even at that time had a bigger budget, that had big teams they were going with, how much did that help to prepare you for the journey that you had going through the following years, where it was kind of a similar story up until you really got to Pabst?
Yeah, I'd say same thing about the car racing years that I was talking about earlier. When you're fighting an uphill battle, you have to fight a little bit harder, and I think it brings out the best in you. So I'm really happy to have had that development. I think the low budget operation, we punched above our weight class, and I'm very happy of the work that we put in. I'm very thankful for my dad for everything he did. He came into the sport knowing nothing about it and was able to learn, enough to, run a full program with me, put the kart together, tune it, and be my engineer week in and week out. And that gave me, a level of desire to, okay, we've shoestringed this thing together. Now let's get the most out of it that we can. And I feel like when you go up against the bigger teams, that, you're fighting a little bit harder for it. And I think that makes you all the better as a driver.
Yeah. And when you come back to the karting paddock now, working for Kart Chaser, I guess since 2022, how different is it from what you remember when you were kind of in the paddock every weekend, say back in 2013, 2014, and kind of where you left off compared to now going and working a lot of these national events these last couple of years?
I would say there are a lot of similarities and a few differences. The differences that I can say that I will highlight is that there's a lot of factory operations now. There were a few back when I was running. It was, not to say there were any less drivers on factory operations, but it was a couple teams. Now we have a bunch of really, really strong operations running week in and week out. And so the amount of teams that have poured into the paddock, I think that's huge for the sport in general. Just seeing the amount of support we have for karting in North America, how much it's grown, and how much, even just working with Kart Chaser, how much work I think we've done to, help promote the sport at its earliest levels. So other than that, I would say there are a lot of similarities. I mean, it's still the X30 engines. It's still, KA is, not too different from Yamaha. It's a little bit faster.
Rest in peace, Yamaha.
Rest in peace, Yamaha. Great engine. There's a lot that's still the same, and even the same drivers that, I've raced against Norberg, raced against Austin Garrison. So a lot of familiar faces as well.
What's going back to the karts to cars situation, or karts versus cars? How important is it to actually have a planned path? Like, rather than just getting out of karts and saying, I want to go to IndyCar, but really having no direction. Like, how important is it to go out there and reach out to the teams that have a development program and create that path?
Definitely. I mean, of all things, this is not something you want to shoot blind. It's a big investment, both in time and money to make it happen. So you better have at least some sort of plan. And the best thing for me was having a lot of great advice. A lot of people that wanted to see me succeed. So a lot of great advice on what directions to take. And honestly, the path that I took was mirrored off of Skylar Robinson. His father, Chip, competed in the IMSA series and World Endurance Championship. I'm not sure if it was even called that back then. in the GTP category. I think he was a factory driver for Nissan, drove for Porsche, Group 44 in the Jaguar. So he was a very, very knowledgeable person, a very, very smart guy who's been a big asset to my career. And I used to go karting with his son, Skylar, and Skylar did a very similar path that I did. He did the Skip Barber series, F1600s, did the Team USA program. And so it was kind of all mirrored off of that. And my goal was, take that and go to IndyCar with it, where his was more take that and go to sports cars, following in his dad's footsteps. And it's just about having good people around you, having good advice to take.
I wanna talk about. Would you say there's a misconception? Because I know I kind of fall for it because I'm still trying to make the whole car thing work, and I feel like I'm too old because all these young kids come in and whoop me a little bit in cars. I'd say, or I think I can hang with them, but at least when I lose like a 14 or 15-year-old, I feel like I'm washed. Would you say there's a misconception to like being too old to go out there and really make it? I know you joke around with Max Garcia or Tertulio is going out there and racing now in USF Pro2000 with you, but you can hang them and you're just as good as all those guys. So would you say there's a misconception between being too old to get to that level?
No, I would say, just because there's such a big, kind of emphasis on, I want to be the youngest driver, I want to be there first. I want to be there before everybody else, the whole Max Verstappen in Formula One at 17, you want to make it to the top and you want it now, you want everything now. But there's a lot of benefit and patience. And obviously I'm saying as someone who did want it, I wanted to be, the youngest driver all the way up. And now I'm, one of the oldest in the series, but I don't see that as any sort of detriment. I see that, I think I have a level of maturity that I didn't have at 16, 17 years old, and a level of decision-making that's evolved over the years, that hopefully can take me farther and keep me from, getting there too early and then washing out because I wasn't mature enough to stay there despite getting at a young age. Maybe if I can get there, in the next couple of years and approach it from a more mature standpoint with still having a lot of development, that I don't see why that would be any holdback on my end.
That's exactly how I look at it as well, because I think as a driver, I feel like I'm as quick as I've ever been just because of the coaching and even for doing Kart Chaser. Like, just from an outsider's perspective, watching people drive, you learn. No matter whether you want to believe it or not, I think you can always learn. And so I feel like as I've gotten older and matured, like you mentioned, I've learned so much about not only just driving, but I think an underrated aspect to racing and getting to that level that I think all of us in here want to get to, which is, making a career potentially out of it, right? And it's that media side. To me, that is something that I didn't understand 3 years ago. And now I've really understood or come to understand what it takes on that end. Would you feel like that is as or more important than actually just being naturally talented as a driver?
I think there's two ways to approach that. You have media where you're, doing interviews and answering questions, and then your social media aspect. And I think that over the years, I've gotten much, much better with, being in front of a camera and being able to talk and articulate myself. And I think that's a huge asset, especially if you're going to go and represent a brand. You have, sponsors that are looking to you to be a mature driver and someone that can, state themselves without, getting lost and looking like a kid on screen. But also the fact of, we live in 2024 now. It's a social media world, so kind of promoting that. And I will say that is definitely my weakest aspect is I was never big, on staying on social media a whole lot. And I have to give, a pretty big shout out to Kendall Hedge, another Kart Chaser employee. She's been helping me a lot with that recently, of trying to, increase the social media presence, as well as your TV interviews and your post race interviews. So I think there's two sides to it, and I think that they're very important. I think still, if you can drive, that's number one, right? You
Yeah.
can't go out there and have a nice smile and then finish last every race and hope to keep going. But I think that if you can bring both sides to it, it's the best way to approach it.
Yeah, and we're kind of entering like a gold mine, so to speak, a little bit in the sense that these last few years we've seen motorsports in the world, motorsports in the US. Not to say that it's fully grown, but we've seen kind of more advertising potential. We've seen more of a kind of casual following. If you had, having been kind of on the business side, having really worked your tail off over the years to secure funding from any number of different places, what kind of advice would you give young drivers that maybe kind of entering the car realm, entering kind of the situation where they need to kind of work themselves into finding funding? How would you sort of give them advice as they look towards the next era of their kind of business ventures and also their racing ventures in the same boat?
Two immediate points that stand out to me. Number one, have confidence in yourself, both in yourself as a person and in yourself as a driver. I think many a great driver said it that every time you go out on track, you have to believe you're the best one out there. That you're the person that should be winning that race. So first and foremost, have confidence in your abilities, and when you do that, then you go to the funding side. Have confidence in yourself to go and reach out. It's a tough battle. I'm fighting it right now. It doesn't end. But my biggest advice is don't give up on it. I've gotten so many lucky breaks that I just never would have expected. Just by staying at it, by not giving up on this dream. And there's times where man, what do I do with my life? Like there's other things that I could have done, other routes I could have taken, but at the end of the day, racing is it has my heart. It's the place that I love, just beyond driving, being at the track, the atmosphere, the paddock, everything about it. And because I have this desire to be there, especially as a driver, it's pushed me to keep going and push through adversity. And you would not believe how many no's it is possible to get. There is no upper limit. People will say no. It doesn't end, and people will continue to say no. And I just, my past few months, don't worry. People say no, but don't quit. Stay with it. You never know what can happen, and it's I think I'm walking evidence that some truly amazing things are possible. Even when I didn't believe in it, when I didn't believe in myself. It's funny how things work. So my biggest advice is, if you really believe and you really want to do it, stay with it.
I think all of us in here have received a lot of no's at some point, but I always tell myself, you're one no closer to a yes, right? So I think that's why, if anybody is watching this is looking to go to that next path, or just stay in karting and want to get funding to go karting, you got to keep at it, right? Like Simon said, you got to believe in yourself.
Well, you're one no closer to a yes, and you're one yes away from racing. So
yeah, exactly.
If you think about it that way, it's
how bad do you want
to
it?
keep pushing. Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, Simon, I gotta say thank you so much. It's been a long time coming for you to be on the show, and so thank you so much for joining us, buddy. We always give this time of the episode to kind of give the floor over to our guests and kind of tell everybody that's watching what's going on in your life, what's coming up, and where they can follow you on socials.
Yeah. Well, what's going on is that same thing we were talking about, just looking for money day in, day out. That's, it's the grind of a race car driver. It's 95% off track, 5% on track. Got to make sure the on track's good, but it takes a lot of work on the side as well. So the off season's just, looking for money, trying to find where I'm going to land next year. There's a lot of things that they could have happened. It's just about nailing down the right one. But as I keep doing that, I hope to see you guys at some kart chaser events here soon. I won't reveal just yet, but you'll see me back at the kart track here shortly. And if you want to keep up with the day-to-day in and out and see how much Kindle Edge has come to help me, then you can follow me at Simon.Sikes on Instagram. It's in the tag there, and at Simon Sikes on X, and all the other medias that exist. So stay tuned. There's more coming, and looking forward to being back at the kart track soon.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for joining us. And I hope, because I know you'll be racing next year, I know you'll make it happen. So I hope to make it some of those races and support you for sure. So Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Simon.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Always a pleasure.
See you, buddy. All right, we're going to take one more quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to do a quick recap of everything, and then we'll sign off for the night.
Kyle, I need a new 219 chain. I need a 77 tooth roof sprocket. I need some more chain lube, and I need it probably as soon as like tomorrow. Dude, are you even listening? Like, we need this to run this weekend.
Want anything else?
What do you mean?
I already got it in the Kart on Acceleration Kart Racing's online store, bro. All orders over $200 get free shipping.
Oh, throw in a set of tires.
Done.
Everything you need, all in one place, and shipped to your door for free on orders of $200 or more. Exclusions apply. Shop AKR.com.
All right, welcome back. Grid Talk Tuesday, episode 29. It's been a good episode, Emory. Unfortunately, Kaleb could not stay with us. Well, I think connectivity issues, for one. And then I know he told me before the show he had a couple of things that he had to do tonight as well. And the show ran a little bit long, so it ended up working out anyways. His internet froze. So you and I for the rest of the night, but it's a quick ending here. We spoke about the rain racing. We'll do one quick recap of it all. What was the biggest thing that stood out to you when going over all those clips?
I mean, like we got to at the beginning of the show, the very first statement that both Kaleb and I made. Kaleb was talking about, the racing action wasn't that good. And, there was some truth to that. Like there wasn't the wheel-to-wheel constant action that you always see at Newcastle. But we got a tactical battle. We had 2 full days basically of drivers finding the limits, finding different areas to push, finding different places to pass, constantly evolving the racetrack. As a racing purist, as a karting purist, this was peak karting for me. It wasn't the prettiest of racing. It wasn't the most pure moves, the most passes you'll ever see, but there was a lot of good driving on display this weekend. And, weather aside, conditions aside, I feel like it was a really, really good race to watch. And I mean, like I said, the amount of detail we were able to go into on the clips between us and as well with Simon, I mean, probably one of the best guys that you could have on a show like this to discuss racecraft, to discuss rain racing and understanding the feel of a go-kart and the feel of a car in general and being able to articulate that. Really good discussion. I hope that anyone that's watching this and is going to watch this back understands the value of that discussion, really could recognize the racing that we saw. It's not necessarily what catches the eye initially in drafting passes and big pack racing, but there's a lot in that you can find, and you can watch guys like AJ, watch guys like Austin Garrison at the top of their game, and really just see that's top level rain racing in the US. And I wouldn't want every weekend to be like that. I wouldn't want washouts every single weekend, but for one weekend of the year, one big national weekend, I felt like it was perfect for us.
I think my favorite part of it all was our first post on Kart's Instagram since arriving at Newcastle was, the rain, and then Marin Kremers commented saying, "Why is it raining when I'm not there?" Because for those who don't know, Kremers is probably one of the best rain drivers in the world, and he always says whenever he comes to the States, it never rains, and then when he's not here, it always rains. And so I think it was funny to see that comment, and for sure, I think I would love to see a rain race in the States when Marin is actually here to see what he can do. But that was pretty funny to me. But I think, like you mentioned, on a serious note, I think both conversations had in terms of rain driving and in terms of what it takes to make it to that next level are very important conversations that I think we got a lot out of today. And I learned a little bit as well just talking to Simon. I know we talked to Simon a lot throughout the year when he comes to the Kart Racer events, but good friend of ours and has a lot of knowledge on what it takes to make it in the sport for a guy that creates all of his opportunities. So I gotta always give my hats off to him, even though I don't have a hat on right now. But hats off because
Where's Kaleb when you need him?
exactly.
Where's that horrendous haircut when you need it? No, but Kaleb will be back in.
Yeah, well, it was good conversations as well. So one more thing I gotta say, I'm excited for Robopong this weekend. I know Emory's gonna be there. I'm not gonna be there, but a really cool event that hasn't happened in a minute. So real quick, Emory, what does it mean to have Robopong back on the schedule?
Man, when we were talking to Simon about his old karting days, I was like, one difference that's now going to be a similarity is we have Robopong back. And I'll kind of break the fourth wall a little bit here and say that when we were discussing the schedule this year and we couldn't announce it early on in the year, this was the event that I was most excited for all year long. Not Supernats, not IME Grands, not anything that came to Mooresville. It's getting RoboPong back for the first time in 10 years. It's a great race. You're going to see a lot of good names on the entry list. It is a challenge unlike any other that you're going to see in American karting. And hey, it's a fun racetrack. Hopefully we'll get to see some dry racing this weekend. And man, I could not be more excited for this. I mean, part of me wishes I was racing it because it's NKA. It's a track that I absolutely love. It's a format that I love. But being able to cover it, being able to be there all weekend and see the scenes, it's going to be special. It's going to kind of take me back to the days when I first got into karting and kind of seeing one of my favorite events come back to life.
Well, that's been Grid Talk Tuesday, episode number 29. Like Emory said, RoboPong is back. You're not going to want to miss it because it's going to be awesome. A lot of great entries this weekend. So, yeah, RoboPong is. Tune in this weekend. You're going to have a big surprise. You're going to get some endurance style racing. So that's always cool. For myself, Alexander Searle, and Emory Lida, so long. This has been Grid Talk episode 29.